You are listening to the Small Town Big Arts podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Kirshner, the CEO of the Academy Center of the Arts in Lynchburg, Virginia. In my own work as an arts leader, I have found it difficult to access resources for arts organizations and artists serving smaller communities. On each episode, Small Town Big Arts sets out to drive conversations and provide inspiration for those serving smaller communities through the arts. If you like what you hear, please rate and review us and share with your friends and colleagues who are working to promote the arts in smaller communities across America. You can also learn more by visiting us at smalltownbigarts.com. Welcome to Small Town Big Arts. This week, I am absolutely thrilled to have Jen Benoit-Bryant, who's the Research Director and Professor of Arts Management at SMU DataArts with us. Jen has led many national research initiatives, including the Museums Moving Forward study of 54 art museums as workplaces, and the most recent 2 cycles of Culture Track studying the role of arts and culture in the lives of more than 100,000 Americans through the COVID-19 crisis. Jen serves as an active research advisor to the National Endowment for the Arts, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, Museums Moving Forward, the League of American Orchestras, and Opera America. Before joining DataArts, Jen was the president of the arts consulting firm Slover Linnet Audience Research. Jen holds a PhD in public administration and research methodology from the University of Illinois, Chicago. And SMU DataArts is a fantastic resource and high on my list in regards to advice I would give anyone in a small community to connect to. And most recently, they released the top 40 most vibrant arts communities of 2023, and they have done this since 2015. And they break these communities up into 3 categories according to the size of the community. And yes, there is a small community category, which we are going to discuss today. Well, Jen, thank you so much for joining us here on Small Town Big Arts. This is a real honor and privilege. I've been a big fan of SMU DataArts and the work that you all do, and I think it's going to be really helpful for the purposes of many in small communities to hear a bit about this recent work that you all have done, the annual report on arts vibrancy that runs across various communities. And small communities themselves are really special ecosystems. And so I'm excited for our conversation today. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed going back through the blog and the podcast and hearing stories from all different kinds of small communities across the country, and just seeing arts vibrancy sort of in full color through the conversations that you have has been great.
Thank you, Jen. I really appreciate that. Well, I think just to get started, many may not know about SMU DataArts. So if you could share a little bit with us about the origins of SMU DataArts, the purpose, the goals.
Yeah, I'd love to. SMU DataArts is about 20 years old. We'll have our anniversary next year. So they started in 2004 as a cultural data project. And it's a project that was started in Pennsylvania as a statewide initiative. It was a collaboration of funders and arts advocates who were asking questions about the health of the arts and culture sector and realizing there was such little data available to answer those questions that this really grew out of that need to really strengthen management, strengthen philanthropy, research and public policy in arts and culture. So fast forward almost a decade, in 2013, this initiative was housed within the Pew Charitable Trusts and had been expanded beyond Pennsylvania to 13 states and Washington. And at that point, it separated from the trust, became an independent nonprofit organization, expanded its focus to be national in scale. And then 5 years ago, we really saw a lot of alignment between what was happening at DataArts and the National Center for Arts Research at Southern Methodist University. And so we have been one entity, a merged entity since then, and have really been focused on providing and engaging individuals and organizations with insights that are evidence-based to really just support the goal of building strong, vibrant, equitable arts communities. So we do that through research. We collect data, we analyze data that others have collected as well as our own, and really try to share that out at a wide range of levels for anyone who's interested.
Well, and this is really helpful to Small Town Big Arts, because a lot of the way that this has operated so far is really storytelling and less focused on data. And so I'm really excited to talk about data today. And I will share with everyone that SMU DataArts does a number of studies throughout the year, has a number of resources that you can take a look at. But very specifically today, what I wanted to talk to Jen about was the top 40 most arts vibrant communities of 2023 that was just recently released. So Jen, if you could just share a little bit about the study itself and its importance before we get into the smaller communities segment of the study.
Great. Yeah. So just some broad grounding. This is a study that we've been running since 2015. And we report on arts vibrancy for every county in the country and then roll that up to city levels of different aggregations and develop an annual report. And it's really since the beginning, we've felt like it's important to highlight a range of cities in terms of size. So small, less than 100,000, medium, 100,000 to 1 million, and then large, over 1 million cities. We really take a data-driven approach to this, examining 13 different characteristics these days on a city's arts ecology. And this is actually the first year to include rankings since 2020. We suspended the rankings during COVID, just feeling like it wasn't really a fair reflection. And we're seeing arts organizations returning to in-person activities and performances following the easing of those pandemic restrictions, and are excited to see kind of who's new on the list and who shifted. It's always a really exciting moment when the results come in.
Well, I saw returning, from the executive summary too, some returning organizations communities. So that's great to see. So I want to dive into the data itself as we begin to talk, because I think it'll be helpful for us to understand why, we may talk a bit about the 10 communities in the 10 most vibrant, according to the data, small communities under 100,000, which works perfect for small town big arts, because under 100,000 is what I define as a small community when we're looking at smaller community arts delivery. So there are these 13 variables that you all take a look at, and I was wondering if we could talk through those. And they break up into three categories. There's the arts providers segment, there's arts dollars, and government support. So maybe if we start with the arts providers, because this is data that's important in kind of understanding the vibrance of a community, is how many people and organizations are doing the work in a community. And then you all categorize that across 4 different categories. So maybe speak a little bit about that, and we'll, as we dive in.
That sounds great, Geoff. We think of these collectively as measures of supply, demand, and public support for the arts. So supply is the first category, where we really think about who's providing the arts and how many people are providing it and how many organizations are providing it. So we have 4 measures in this group. The first is independent artists themselves. So this includes freelance artists that are primarily engaged in performing in artistic productions or creating artistic and cultural works. And all of that is aggregated up to the zip code level. This is, along with all of these measures, this is a per capita measure. So it doesn't sort of privilege larger cities compared to smaller cities. We're normalizing for the size of the community here. We also measure arts and culture employees that are employed by organizations like museums, theaters, historical sites, dance, music, opera, performing arts. That includes both salaried employees as well as independent contractors working in those kinds of organizations. And then the arts and culture organizations themselves, the number of nonprofit organizations across those same kind of sectors of arts and culture. And then finally, we have a broader category that's arts, culture, and entertainment firms. And so this actually includes other organizations that aren't incorporated as nonprofits, that might be for-profit. Broadway is one that a lot of people are familiar with as an example of kind of a for-profit arts and culture.
What are some examples we might see in a smaller community? For context,
of a for-profit arts organization. I mean, it could include something like there are a lot of these like sip and paint kinds of organizations where you can come in and make your own pottery piece or artwork masterpiece, of course. And so those might be more prevalent in smaller communities. But touring productions too can be for-profit and sometimes make it into smaller communities.
Oh, interesting. So those, even though those touring productions are not necessarily based out of that locale, that goes into the data if they visit a community. Is
Oh,
that
that's a good point. No, it's going to get reflected wherever they're based. So that would be,
so? If you're like Missoula Children's Theater, for example, you will go into Missoula as
yeah,
opposed to all the places that you're going to outside.
that's
Okay.
right. That's a good point.
Okay. And then with that, really quick before we move on to the next category, of those four, I just want to point out too, one of the things I love about the data points, and it runs just in terms of the percentage. When you all are putting this together, the independent artists are 7%, arts and culture employees 7%, arts and culture organizations are 8%, arts and culture and entertainment firms are 7%. It's pretty equally distributed across, and I do think this idea of we'll talk a bit about this, the ecosystems, right, that are created. Kind of need all of them together to execute our artistic art endeavors in a community, right? I mean, you kind of need all of those to exist, and so they're equally weighted across the data.
Yeah, the weights that we determine across these 13 measures are really statistically determined. So there's a kind of factor analysis procedure where if you have a hypothesis that there's an underlying dimension here, and for us that's arts vibrancy, that connects all of these different variables, but that there's also a lot of overlap between them. Like you said, they are interrelated and they don't exist in a vacuum. This helps us come up with the right sort of set of weights for them. And it's interesting to see that this sort of art providers measure is sort of in the middle. Arts dollars gets ranked a little bit higher in terms of its likelihood of predicting this concept of arts vibrancy. And then government support is generally a little bit lower.
Yeah, that's great. So that's a good segue into arts dollars. And unfortunately, money makes the world go round. So tell us a little bit about arts dollars and how that comes into it as a factor.
Yeah, so arts dollars, this is data that we are getting from the 990 forms that nonprofit organizations submit, but it's also data that comes in through our own cultural data profile survey and those of partners like the theater communications groups. That's where we're getting this data on sort of demand for arts and culture within communities. So that includes four measures: program revenue, so all revenue earned due to people participating in the kinds of activities or programming put on by arts and culture organizations; contributed revenue, which is those that are coming from donations, contributions, foundation support, individual philanthropic giving to nonprofit arts and culture organizations; the total expenses of those organizations; and then the total compensation paid to staff and artists by nonprofit cultural organizations. So this whole category is just looking at nonprofit organizations, and that's because that's the only part of the sector that we have this kind of data available for. We'd love
Well,
to
and they
expand
are,
it and include more, but
yeah, but they are a major engine, right? When we look at
they are.
the provider section, right, they're going to be a major engine. They're going to be the ones that are employing the individuals, right, who are administering. They're going to be employing the artists in a lot of circumstances. And even in some cases, I know for us here in Lynchburg, very often too, we're housing some of the examples of the for-profit firms that may, right, they may be doing some of their work through us. So it does make a lot of sense. The other thing I appreciate about this is that it is both on the revenue and expense side. And obviously, there's always the balance act, whether in a small community or a large community, both in raising dollars, but also producing work or presenting work that is going to have value in the free market. There's just a
Yeah.
certain reality to that, and it can be a tough balance, right, when we are both trying to meet the demands of funders and donors while also meeting the demands of ticket buyers or tuition paying students or any of the rest of it. So it is all together, and I think any of us in the sector who are working know that, right? We know that when we are if we're booking stuff here in our space, we're both contending with what people are going to buy as well as what people are going to fund or institutions are going to fund. And so that all being in there makes a lot of sense. And I do think that the funding also having a bit of a higher weight in the data makes sense to me too, in regards to what we're seeing. And we'll talk about this in a bit, but also the purpose, right? How you can use this data moving forward in your own communities to advocate for arts funding is obviously at play. So finally, we have government support. and this is, funding too. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is the measure of public support for arts and culture organizations, and it includes two state level measures. One is total dollars from the state that is funneling into local arts and culture organizations, as well as the number of grants being awarded. We have those same two measures at the federal level so federal arts dollars, federal arts grants, and then we've recently added a new measure that's total government support. So that overlaps with federal and state, of course, but it also includes local support that wouldn't be captured otherwise in this data. So we think it's an important addition to kind of the picture overall and has been interesting here. And this is data that we're getting from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and then the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. So we pool all of that data together, link it all up geographically, and then look to see what those patterns are.
Yeah, I was wondering, is it harder to get that local giving data?
It's really hard to get it in a systematic way. And so basically what we do is we look at the 990s from arts and culture organizations. Many of them, especially if they're not audited, aren't going to specifically note the local giving, but because we can triangulate with what we know is coming in at the state level and the federal level from the donor source, we can then we know that what's left, right, is that local contribution amount.
Got it. And as many know, and just in the last podcast, interviewed Margaret Hancock, who's the executive director of the Virginia Commission for the Arts here in Virginia, our state agency. One of the things that came up is that very often, these local grants, right, can be leveraged for corporate giving, individual giving, and so again, right, these things are all bouncing off of each other and all a part of a larger, we're talking about vibrancy and the ability to deliver the arts. These are all together in the stew. And very often these state grants too are leveraged for local giving. And so, Virginia has an example of that of one of the Virginia Commission for the Arts grants is a leverage grant for local support. I will say, and I for anyone out there, take a look at your community. That we're going to talk about the top 10 here in a bit, but all of the communities in the United States are on a map right now on the SMU DataArts website. And so I was able to look up my own community, and it was interesting. It was interesting to see because where Lynchburg landed in regards to public support was in the 90th, I guess the 90th percentile. Would that be the right way to say it? Mm-hmm. Which I was actually surprised to see. And the reason that is from my own perspective, right, as an arts leader in my community. And I think it might be, we can talk through this a little bit. It was maybe good for me to see from my own sort of, woe is me perspective on things sometimes. But I Virginia is notoriously low in regards to state agencies funding the arts. We know that within our own state, there's lots of conversations about it. I'm on the Virginians for the Arts Board, and so we spend a lot of time talking about where we land in all of the states. I think right now we're in the 40s somewhere in regards to the 50 states. So I learned that, we did as our organization here, we did draw some NEA funding, NEA grants here. And locally, right, there is, we do have some project grants that exist. So they're here. They do generate, but I often feel like I wish that our local government was doing more. But a question I have, and this may not come up in the data, one thing that our locale has done, and not this year, but in the past, one of the ways that our local government has engaged in the arts is in capital investment. So giving to, for instance, our historic theater was renovated and restored, and our local government contributed $3.5 million into that. Would investment in capital improvements or capital projects show up in this data?
Yeah, it should show up as contributions to these organizations on their 990 forms. So if a city is contributing to like a city held resource, a city owned resource, like a performing arts space that they then make available for free or for discounted rates to local arts and cultural organizations, that wouldn't show up. So that's another form of potential support. But if they are funneling those funds through arts and cultural organizations individually or collectively, then those would show up in these numbers. And from looking at your blog, I know that it's very much on your radar, the fact that a building and the capital expenses required to maintain it can be a lodestone around the neck of arts and cultural organizations.
Yeah, and I think this is a balance act, for locales or for individuals in smaller communities. So I'll just use this as an example, and I'm always sometimes hesitant to talk about these things openly, but it's okay. I think it's helpful for people to hear. Literally right now, as we speak, here in Lynchburg, Virginia, last night in our city council meeting, our local government our city manager is trying to move forward a amphitheater that would be built in a park here in the city. And so they're asking for city council to approve an additional $3 million to go into this project. One of my concerns when I look at this, though, is that we don't have a strong record locally in regards to annual government continual contributions to arts and culture activities like operations. So like our organization, the Academy Center of the Arts, they have contributed to our capital projects here. But we're really very much on our own in regards to our annual operating budget. So we don't get very much in regards to local contributions, and we're not built into the city budget. And that is problematic for us in our facilities long-term for us to kind of keep up with them. So when I've looked at this project happening with the amphitheater, very often my concern is that, we can get this maybe amphitheater done, but then how are we operating it once it opens? Is the local government going to participate in that? And so I think, that's one of the reasons I asked the question too, in regards to that local contribution. And I think for everybody to kind of think about that, right? I think one of the things that's really great on the state level is that states are very often providing general operating grants, and that's critical to how we kind of operate and move, and that's consistent. But on the local level, that's a data point that I often see, right? Or that's a point where I see a divide, right? Or understanding for locales, and understand you can put the investment into the capital project, but then what are you doing to help sustain it afterwards?
Huge. Yep.
And so I think our 90 score, to me, that was also why I was like, whoa, that's way higher than I thought it would be. Yeah. Because in my mind, I'm like, and maybe this is just an American problem and not a Virginia or Lynchburg, Virginia problem, I was like, man, I really feel like we need more, government support than we're getting, but we're in the 90th percentile.
And it's per capita too, so that might be part of what's being adjusted there. But it's also interesting because sometimes these scores fluctuate really significantly. We've seen huge government intervention, right, in arts and culture over the last couple of years, much, out of line with what's ever been done in the past. Yeah. And so understanding how, is this a one-time investment that's being made in a capital campaign, for instance, or is this a continuous level of support? Those are really different. As you mentioned, as a really different kinds of support for arts and culture organizations, both important, but that reliable ongoing support that can be directed where you need it is really critical. I will say that there's a really interesting infrastructure project that's tracked by Adrian Ellis and Associates, a consulting firm that we partner with really frequently, and we're actually going to take a look to see the kind of alignment between infrastructure investment in communities over the last decade, which is data that AEA has been tracking, and arts vibrancy to try to get a sense of whether or not the big infrastructure projects are being put in communities that already have extremely high vibrancy and are sort of continuing to double down in those areas, or whether or not they're being used as a lever for equity and in extending vibrancy, and what kind of impact they might have over time on a community's arts vibrancy levels.
That's fascinating. I think that is a great study opportunity because I think that there's a little bit of chicken or the egg very often too with these things, and it's one of the things personally, as I've been watching this amphitheater go down, there's a part of me that's like, well, hey, you know what? Like maybe there's a part of this that this has to get built to even establish a level of understanding that the local government has to be involved. And so maybe that has to happen first. Well, I want to get into a little bit of one of the things I was excited to see from looking at the study is that, really how closely weighted all 13 of those variables are. And I found continually in discussions with organizations and communities that a lot of the success stories, there is a really diversity in how they operate, both in regards to revenue moving in and moving out, or the number of partners that are involved to execute something. So, one of my most recent interviews and discussions was with a group of organizations and businesses in Keene, New Hampshire, and they have figured out how to create a live music scene by really shared revenue and expenses across for-profit entities, along with a nonprofit organization, actually multiple nonprofit organizations. And that's how they're getting it done. I think if there was one organization that was just trying to promote concerts in Keene, New Hampshire, which has about 20,000 people, it just wouldn't be possible. So I was really intrigued, and maybe an entry point for us is maybe talk a little bit about Jackson, Wyoming, which is the top small, most vibrant, according to the data, in terms of arts vibrancy of small communities. And I looked a little bit at Jackson, and I noted Jackson has the Center, which is an organization actually not dissimilar from my own organization here in Lynchburg, in that it's a arts organization that is really serves as an umbrella for a number of essentially resident companies that are separate nonprofit organizations that plug into it. But I also saw in Jackson, right, a really vibrant individual artist community. Clearly, lots of artisans, lots of ways that the arts are being delivered. It's also a very wealthy community, and I think we want to talk a little bit about that too, right? This is it's a destination point. It has tourism. I also, what I like about Jackson too is I think there sometimes can be, particularly in sort of the way that politics and the arts are viewed. It's in Wyoming, which is a conservative, Republican leaning state, and I think that was also interesting for me to see, when very often we associate progressive politics with arts funding, and it seems to be much more complicated than that, as often things are. So I was wondering if what you all saw in Jackson and all of those top communities, if are they really strong in one set of areas and that's how they're getting up there, or are you seeing it, as I'm sort of imagining it, that it's really that they're sort of hitting all the points, right? That's across the board.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's one I'm really fascinated by and would love to explore further. I think is the extent to which we do have some communities, often at the top of the list, who are just in the top 1% kind of across the board on so many of these measures, and they're excelling everywhere. But I'd say that's not the most common kind of setup. That often we'll see that an organization is excelling in arts providers in particular, but maybe more middle of the pack in terms of public support, or in terms of the kind of demand measures of dollars that are happening in communities. So I think it's really fascinating to see what's most connected. Sorry, I keep getting blurry here. What's most connected across these measures. I will say that Jackson, Wyoming in the 2023 rankings is doing pretty well across the board, right? They're in the top 20 on every single measure of the top, of all these 13 measures that we're looking at. We also see really strong positive correlations between leisure activities generally. Like you might think that if there's a lot of leisure in a community, that's a competitor for the arts and might drive down arts and culture participation, because people are doing things outdoors, or zoos or aquariums or restaurants or hotels. But we actually see that those are complements, and that communities with high leisure, which can connect to that tourism point that you made, actually also have really vibrant arts and culture communities. So I think once you attract can attract this group, there's sort of this built-in set of restaurants and complements to the arts and culture activities people want to engage in.
And that makes a lot of sense. One of I've kind of divided up organizations I see over and over again in small communities into 5 categories, and one of them I call the enclave.
Mm.
And it is essentially a type of organization that I see often where a group of artists have made an artistic home in a remote area that is
Yep.
really beautiful or has something going for it that wine country or skiing or whatever else exists there, and that they have gone to the smaller community and are creating artistic work at a pretty high level, but they thirsts for getting out of a large metropolitan area for a period of time. But very often that will, it coincides with being able to draw the economics of it for them, as they have to reach beyond the population of that specific community to make it work, right? The ticket buyers have to be wider than the residents. And so it makes a lot of sense that you would have a lot of leisure activity or something like that that's already drawing people there. In Jackson, right, probably skiing during the day, and then at night they're going to a concert, right? They're
I think
shopping,
that's right.
you
And it
know.
also influences that per capita measure, right? We're measuring these relative to the people who actually live there. So if you have a ton of people coming into that community, but who aren't actually residents of that community, then it sort of boosts the scores of those communities,
Yeah,
relatively
that makes
speaking.
a lot of sense. And I saw that a lot in the top 10. I saw a number of, there's a lot, talking about skiing. I saw places
Yep.
where people ski that was popping up in there, and not all of them. And obviously, and I was kind of curious about that. And I think even looking at our own community here in Lynchburg, one of the things that we did pretty well on was arts providers, and I think that's definitely the case here. We have a lot of small organizations that exist, and but we were lower on arts dollars, and that also lined up and made sense, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I think if you know all of these communities being able to hit all 13 of these marks pretty high creates a pretty viable um, ecosystem for arts delivery. And I think as those 13 variables, I think out in the sector, looking at all 13 of those and thinking about how you're talking about them, addressing them, thinking about how they interact with each other and how they boost each other. I love this notion of the leisure activity not being a competition, but being something that lifts it up. And I do think that that's an important dynamic of this study
Mm-hmm.
to discover and look at.
I will say
Um,
too that, what we've reported on here is obviously large, mid-size, and small size communities, which is what we've been doing since the start of this work. We're planning to release state level rankings for the first time in the new year, so that we're really working closely with some advisors about what kind of information would be most valuable at the state level and thinking about what that looks like. But we're also considering actually releasing a ranking for counties that have neither a micropolitan nor a metropolitan center in them. So more rural counties, because
really
they there are also counties like that that are in the top 5% of all counties across the country.
interesting. That's a great segue, Jen. Let's talk a little bit about the metropolitan statistical area, the MSAs, the micropolitan statistical area. Talk about the definition of that, what that is, because I think
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time, like in these smaller communities, how we define a community is really fluid
Yeah.
and not clean.
It is not clean. Yes, I agree. And it's shifted over time as the federal government has adjusted their systems here. So the system that we use aligns with what the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, and the federal government releases. And so they have three main categories. There are some others, but three main categories. And one is metropolitan statistical area, that is an urban area of 50,000 or more in population. But crucially, it also attaches any additional kind of suburbs in which there are strong ties between that metropolitan area and the suburbs. And they measure things like commute, like how many people are commuting between the suburbs and the center, in order to draw the boundaries around what this metropolitan statistical area is. And so I live in Chicago, and ours is huge, right? It goes down into Indiana, it goes up into
Yeah,
Wisconsin.
yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a large area. And I think that that is useful for a lot of things. I think it's useful for arts and culture because we look at who's attending arts and culture organizations, we find that they are drawing not just from the city itself and the boundaries of the city, but from the adjacent suburbs. And so for some things, it may be more useful to just look at city areas themselves, but we find that when we're really thinking about who's engaging with and connecting with arts and culture, this broader definition makes more sense. So that's metropolitan statistical areas. There's also micropolitan statistical areas that are sort of the same definition, but it drops the size of the urban cluster that's needed to 10,000 people or more. So that's like 10,000 to 49,999, and then it would bump up to a metropolitan statistical area. And then there are counties that have neither of those things in effect, and so they wouldn't be classified as either of them. When we look at metropolitan and micropolitan, that covers almost 95% of the U.S. population lives in one or the other of those two kinds of areas, and about a little over 5% live in areas without them. But it's interesting because there's 1,300 counties that are outside of the classification, even though there's just 5% of 3,142 counties overall. So it's about a third of counties outside of that classification system and just 5% of population.
Yeah, so my last conversation with Margaret Hancock at the Virginia Commission for the Arts was about the initiative that the Virginia Commission for the Arts is trying to do right now, which I think is smart politically, and that they're trying to reach every single municipality in the state of Virginia with Virginia Commission for the Arts funds. And I think that a lot of this is oriented around the state budget process, and it's been in the national news. Virginia is definitely a swing state, and there's lots of dynamics in regards to our large metropolitan areas that are up in Northern Virginia around Washington, D.C., as well as the coastal areas in and around Hampton Roads. And obviously if a legislator is not receiving any funds from the Virginia Commission for the Arts, they're obviously not going to care very much about it in the budget. So they have been trying to reach all the communities, and I think they're down now to just I think about a dozen that they have not been able to reach. And hearing this, it makes me really think about how these MSAs, right, are again these ecosystems. It's these things are bouncing off each other, lifting each other up, and then if you are popping outside of right some sort of population density, right, then it becomes very hard to, the funding's not getting there because there isn't their traditional way of delivering the funds is through a nonprofit cultural organization. And if one does not exist in that community, then it's hard for them to distribute the funds. And they're looking at things like libraries, school systems, community centers, YMCAs, things like that. Yeah. And so I'm not sure what my point is here, but I do think that is an interesting factor to look at when we think about arts vibrancy and communities that can support the arts and how those arts are supported, and thinking about how that works. So I found it really interesting that
I think that's admirable. I think we know that public support, especially local arts agency support, which we've examined in its own research study, but that it has significant impacts on arts vibrancy across the board, especially on the ability of organizations to hire employees, right? That the concentration of employees in particular goes up in a per capita sense in communities that have strong local arts agency support. But I think the same could potentially be true for state arts agency support within these smaller communities. And just as a little preview, I've been really digging around in this rural data recently. It's really fascinating to see, in particular, that kind of socioeconomic index and the extent to which we have rural areas that are showing up in the top 5% of all areas with a range of kind of socioeconomic conditions. I'd say on average, they are higher than average in terms of socioeconomics, but we're seeing some that are well below average in terms of SES status showing up in the top 5%. But overall, if we look at that top 5% of counties across the country, just 2% in that top 5% just 2% are rural areas. So it is more likely for you to fall into that top 5% if you're a city.
Yeah. I might though, these outliers, I'm probably going to circle back with you at some
Yeah,
point.
I'd love to.
Some of the outliers, I would love to dig into what's happening there
Yeah.
some more, just to sort of see, because I think it's in my mind, that's really where I mean, inherently, right? We as a culture, as communities, right? We engage in creative endeavors. We create artistic work, and the more that you congregate people together and create systems that communities create, then inherently, right, the arts are going to emerge, right? And there are going to be ingredients that you can put into the stew that are going to make it stronger or weaker. But obviously, population is going to be a big driver, and I think I'm very curious how arts vibrancy, and so I will, as we move into this, I'm going to be connecting
Yep.
with SMU DataArts and trying to find out how this happens when we don't have that as clearly. So one thing I want to, as we're rounding the corner here, I would love to. So the study's been happening since 2015. I wanted to see if there are some trends that you are seeing right now. Obviously, COVID and the data, and there's all kinds of things there that created a weird blip for all of us. But what are you all seeing right now, good and bad, in the data? Just some trends that are happening across. I mean, obviously, small communities is the focus, so maybe we'll start there, and then maybe a little bit of discussion on the national level too.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's a hard one to answer with this data because it is really set up to be relative. Like all of the dimensions that we're sharing out, these rankings are relative to each other. And so it doesn't do a very good job of measuring absolute change in a community over time. It's sort of relative change in those communities, or how they're doing relative to other peers. So a city might have actually had a drop in some of their measures from one year to another, but keep the same ranking if other cities are also dropping in their measure. So if
Okay.
everybody's dropping down, then it looks the same, right? We still get a ranking of the top 40 cities, and it's hard to tell what's happening underneath that. But we have recently taken a look across 2,000 organizations that have completed cultural data profile surveys on their finances over the last 4 years. So we do have some trend data. I don't know if you're interested. Most of it is not small organization specific, but I have a few data points that are about small organizations.
Yeah.
It's really about the financial health emerging from the pandemic. And we see that as cultural organizations are emerging, they're much better capitalized than ever before, generally speaking, in terms of their
Yeah.
access to cash, because they've gotten these big influxes during the pandemic while costs have been cut. So while that's the case, they're much better capitalized. They're experiencing some really challenging circumstances as they're trying to reopen and navigate the current situation. I'm sure I don't have to tell you, a workforce crisis. There's lower attendance than prior to the pandemic, less relief funding, and rising costs, particularly staffing costs for arts and culture organizations. So even though balance sheets look relatively good, right? Even better in some cases than before the pandemic, there's this kind of perfect storm of contributions not keeping up with inflation, as well as rising expenses that are eating away at that kind of reserve that organizations might be holding on to from the pandemic.
It may be hard to tell, or maybe I mean, I guess because it is, the national, whatever's happening nationally is the somewhat of a major component here. But there are anecdotally, and this may be completely my own personal experience, but I'm in a smaller community, but networked and in a lot of communication with colleagues in larger communities, and particularly subscription-based organizations definitely match everything that you just said. But I am finding here in smaller communities that we're because we're not too. This again gets to the diversity of revenue and how things are set up. We're not overly dependent on one means of delivery, right? So if I'm a theater company and I'm doing a subscription series and I'm really dependent on subscribers and individual ticket buyers, then I am in trouble, or I'm struggling. But I'm finding in some of these smaller communities there's a little bit more nimbleness and ability to move and flex with the environment, and because we're not overly reliant in one means of delivery.
Yeah.
And that might just be our own particular organization, but we've been able to kind of meet the moment by increasing how much access programming we do that, receives funding that would sometimes go towards things that are oriented around social services, or we are able to kind of switch the types of programs that we do that are ticket based more easily, because our mission isn't like specifically like we do theater, right? It's like,
Yeah.
we're a small community arts organization, so that's pretty broad.
Yeah.
You want this thing and that's what you're actually coming to, then we'll do that thing for you. So it's a little bit easier for us to pivot. We do see definitely price point sensitivity. So we're seeing that tickets that are more expensive, events that are more expensive, are definitely the ones that are struggling. But
Yeah.
we're able to kind of say, okay, well, if that's a problem here, then we're going to try to bring some things in or do some things that have lower price points. So I don't know if that's showing up at all, that you're seeing smaller communities more flexible in handling
Yeah.
it or not. Because I definitely hear what you said to me is definitely what I'm seeing and hearing from the larger markets.
Mhm.
But I am maybe seeing a little bit more dexterity in the smaller communities.
That resonates. And I think it's a really exciting just dimension of resiliency that is available, and nimbleness that's available, and perhaps even a sign of how close your ear is to the ground of what your community wants and needs. I think for some organizations, being able to pivot requires getting some kind of input back, right, about what worked and what didn't. And sometimes that's just, how many people bought tickets or attended, but it can be more nuanced than that in terms of talking to people about what they need and what role you can serve. And I certainly heard many examples of small arts and cultural organizations doing that much more consistently and perhaps more effectively than large organizations. And then I think that sense of how how much of an organization's capital is really sunk into fixed costs and buildings, and large organizations have made huge investments in that, and it really reduces the extent to which they can flex and be nimble. But all of that said, one of the interesting statistics I think about small, medium, and large organizations, and the breakout down here for small arts organizations is less than $120,000 in revenue, is that when we look at sort of their bottom lines and how much operating surplus they have now compared to before the pandemic, the only group for whom that number has dropped is small organizations. So they've gone from 4.5% before the pandemic to 4.1% of their revenue as that sort of operating surplus. And medium and large organizations have had a 2 to 4-fold increase over that same period of time in their operating surpluses. So they both have larger fixed expenses and maybe less flexibility, but they also have a bigger reserve that they're able to draw from.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Well, and I think obviously with data, right, it's it as it comes out, it's a little bit like a time machine too, right? You're kind of
Yeah.
you're looking backwards.
Yes.
It's even like what's happening now, because I do know, right? I do know, again, it's anecdotal, but a lot of that pandemic money has drawn down now. It's gone. And people are now floating out in the ocean
Yep.
and trying to figure out how they stay afloat now without that government aid. So it will be interesting. The next study will be interesting, and I would sort of say for everybody to stay tuned and take a look at it as it
That would
comes
be
out.
great. That would be great. I will say that some of these concerning metrics, like attendance being down 42% for median organizations in fiscal year 2022, a 30% inflation adjusted decline in earned revenue compared to 2019, that we're not seeing in the data that we have that's more recent, which is really constrained to performing arts organizations, where we're able to collect attendance data and take a look at it with less kind of downtime between. We're not seeing those trends reverse in terms of declining attendance. So it will be interesting. Yes, absolutely. We want to get to that next point where we can get the next set of data, given that this is lagged. But the indications seem to be that struggle continues.
Yeah, we again, it's anecdotal. We are as a multiple arts center that does a wide range of things. Our ticket volume is not down.
Oh,
It's
that's
actually,
great.
but I don't, but I will say that when I look at our cultural partners, nonprofit organizations that are within our facilities, some of the more traditional, our opera company, our ballet, um, uh, interesting enough, our symphony though is fine, and I don't know what that is, and I am seeing a little bit of a decline in their ticket revenue, and so it's not that it doesn't exist here in a small community. It may be going back again to, we've been able to pivot and respond to our audience's demands. Us as, as an organization that presents,
Yeah.
we've been shift and turn more quickly and have more opportunities available to us in regards to what that looks like and offering the audience in regards to price point, what it is. That's been harder for organizations that have a mission that's like, I do opera, right? And that just comes with expenses that are difficult to adjust and change. It's going to take a while, right? So as we wrap up, Jen, this has been great. I would love to uh, make sure that we equip everybody with what they should do with this study, because I think it is a fantastic tool to utilize for communities across America, organizations across America, artists across America. What should we do with this study now that we have it?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways that people have been activating it. I think one that is really exciting is in terms of just getting recognition that your community deserves in the areas where you are excelling, sharing that. We see it show up actually on mayors' website pages, city council members, state legislators. They can tout it as a success. And if they're invested in what you're doing as a community, that can help galvanize future support and keep them invested in what you're doing. I think that it can be useful for organizations that might be thinking about where you want to relocate operations or where you want to send touring performances. You might not be familiar with every potential possibility, and this can give you a benchmark there. We've actually even had people use it to decide where to move themselves personally across the country, which is fantastic.
Great, it's a great advertisement for the
Right? I love it. And then you can also benchmark your community. If a lot of organizations think about who are our aspirational peers, who do we want to be more like? And so if you can choose some of those and track where they are, understand how they've gotten to that place in some of these dimensions, that can be helpful for just setting some goals and tracking progress over time. And then I think it can also help just understand where might investments in arts vibrancy have the most impact, right? Where is our community, relatively speaking, behind others, and where are we already excelling, and in which case perhaps continuing to funnel more resources into those areas might not be as effective as distributing them.
Yeah, one of the things I will share that I had a budget presentation for my board of directors last week, and I utilized the study uh, for a discussion oriented around the sort of long-term trajectory for the organization and our ability to sort of navigate some funding challenges that we have in regards to facilities upkeep. As we mentioned earlier, that's a big topic of for me, and I think certainly for the sector. So I used some statistics from Jackson as a tool for me to sort of talk about Lynchburg relative to Jackson, and what we thought might our statistics might mean next to their statistics in regards to our capacity, ability, and what we might want to do. So I will share, this is really helpful, and I think when you're interacting and talking to your local government, it's also extremely helpful. It's funny. I literally was texting city management this morning because I'm getting a lot of questions about this amphitheater from people, and I want to be on their side. And I was like, hey, listen, I need some help from you guys right now and how I talk about this, because how are we going to fund the operations of this moving forward? And I think that looking at how other entities operate and work and supply funding for the arts is a great tool in talking to your local government officials. So, Jim, what I always end this with advice you might have for individuals in small communities delivering the arts. From what you've been doing in your research, what advice might you have for those out in the field?
Well, let me start with the fact that I'm very interested in listening to and learning from those individuals, that I think they have incredibly deep expertise. And I love that this podcast brings that to light in a lot of different ways, and would love to think about how we might partner with you on that going forward. But looking across our research, some of the areas that might be helpful here, I think, have come up in our conversation. Coalition building, right? What kinds of coalitions could be formed between organizations or in public-private kind of partnerships that could really coalesce awareness of local arts and cultural strengths and artistic or cultural tradition that might be authentic to a specific area, I think is really interesting. Like the Blue Ridge Craft Trails is a nice example of an organization that's really helped promote and bring more attention and visitation to artisans within a rural community.
Yeah.
And I think, advocating for increased support for your local arts agency, if one exists, or helping to formulate one if one doesn't, our research shows a really direct positive impact of local arts agency dollars. And then there are some really interesting resources at the National Endowment for the Arts that I don't know whether or not these have come up here previously, but programs specifically for rural communities like the Citizens Institute on Rural Design and the National Folklife Network are both potential options, both for networking, but also for sort of access to resources for rural communities, specifically in the arts.
Yeah, and that's a thing, I do, thank you for bringing that up, because I think that one of the things that has come up in conversations I've had with those in rural communities is that, finding peers and national networks can be hard at times. And I do think that some of these programs on the national level, even just looking at them, right, who are past recipients, who's utilizing them, what does it look like? It suddenly opens the door to a network of peers, professionals in the field that are doing what you're doing, who can be good examples. And also, I talk about the emotional aspects of this. You feel less alone. It's a very, you're already in a smaller community, so it can feel isolating in some regard. In some ways, not though. Too. Sometimes these communities are more tightly knit, but you certainly, as an arts professional, can sometimes feel isolated. And so I think finding examples in these networks is really a big deal. And I would put SMU DataArts into that. The work that you all are doing to reach out to the field and to listen, which I love, is a big part of how we're going to create stronger arts delivery in smaller communities. So Jen, thank you. I really have just deeply appreciate this. I love what you all do. It's a fantastic resource for organizations. I really encourage you all to utilize the resources that SMU DataArts has, but also engage and participate. We have participated in a couple of studies with SMU DataArts over the last few years, and it's been really helpful to us as an organization, just in terms of our own understanding of how we kind of fall into our ability in regards to equity, access, programs, delivery, all the rest of it. So definitely. Real quick, Jen, just share website information for folks so they can check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is culturaldata.org. And I will just plug that we are going to do an Arts Vibrancy Spotlight where we have 2 communities sharing out that are in the small and mid-size range, which is the focus of this for Arts Vibrancy tomorrow at 2 Central Time. It's free. There'll also be a recording up on our website if you're perhaps listening to this podcast a little later.
I plan to be there. That's my plan. I plan to be there and listen, and I encourage everybody else to do the same. Well, Jen, thank you so much. I really appreciate this, and I hope to connect soon. And I want to connect on these.
Yes, I will keep you posted. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Geoff.
Jen. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Small Town Big Arts. Remember to rate and review us and share with your friends. To learn more, visit us at smalltownbigarts.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Jeffrey Kirshner.